Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal as the soft morning light spilled over Port Charles, casting a golden hue across the harbor and glimmering off stained glass windows of the historic chapel overlooking the square. The town stirred in anticipation of a wedding that was supposed to unite hearts and heal past wounds. It was meant to be the culmination of a redemptive arc, the renewal of hope, the symbolic merging of pain and promise. Willow's final step toward stability after years of grief, betrayal, and emotional erosion. The church had been transformed into a sanctuary of light and elegance, adorned with ivory drapery flowing like whispered prayers between pews, with delicate blush roses tucked into every corner as if the very walls bloomed in blessing. But behind the fragile beauty and ceremonial grace lurked something darker, something corrosive, something waiting to unravel all pretense. This was not simply a wedding. It was a reckoning. It was a trap carefully laid and cruelly timed, not to celebrate love, but to expose the elaborate deceit of a man who had manipulated the very idea of love for his own personal gain, Drew. The Drew Kane who once entered Port Charles as a haunted veteran with a noble heart had vanished long ago, replaced by a shrewd architect of psychological warfare. No longer a quiet protector, Drew had evolved into a master manipulator, weaving intricate lies like a spider wraps silk around prey, subtle, elegant, lethal. To the public, he remained a figure of strength and resolve, a man who'd endured and survived. But to those who dared look closer, especially Nina, the mask was beginning to slip. Drew had become something insidious, a man who weaponized affection, who preyed on emotional vulnerability, and who viewed Willow not as a partner but as a pawn. An asset, a tool through which he could seize influence over the Corinthos family and expand his reach into the powerful and corrupt circles of Port Charles's medical and corporate empires. Willow, radiant in her bridal gown of cascading silk, her blonde hair softly twisted to reveal the innocent frame of her face, walked with a serene grace down the aisle, unaware that every step was leading her not to salvation, but to annihilation. She had clung desperately to the promise Drew offered. A new beginning, the return of her children, the illusion of family. She was still reeling from the pain of losing Michael, from the custody battle that left her hollow, from the crushing sense of powerlessness that defined her life. Drew had convinced her that he alone could restore what was lost. He had whispered hope into her ears so convincingly that she had begun to silence the gnawing doubts in her heart. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet allow herself to believe, was that Drew was the very architect of her heartbreak. That everything she thought she was reclaiming had been stolen by the man she now approached at the altar. Among the guests, hidden beneath the soft shadows at the edge of the room, Nina stood like a statue of retribution. Dressed in a midnight black dress that devoured the morning light, her expression was cold, sharpened by months of quiet rage and pain. Her eyes no longer carried the shimmer of maternal longing. They were steel now, forged by betrayal and loss. Nina had begged for peace. She had pleaded with Drew, appealed to his conscience, implored him to come clean. She had even prayed, foolishly, that his affection for Willow might become genuine. But in time, the truth revealed itself with cruel clarity: Drew did not love her daughter. He loved the influence she represented. He craved power, not intimacy. Control, not connection. As the priest lifted his voice and asked the timeless question, if anyone present had reason this marriage should not proceed, there was a stillness, a suspended breath, a pause pregnant with unspeakable tension. Then Nina stepped forward. There was no dramatic shout. No trembling voice. She simply walked with quiet authority to the edge of the aisle, holding a small silver USB drive between her fingers. She handed it to the technician stationed by the AV console, nodded once, and returned to the shadows. Within seconds, the soft instrumental wedding music was interrupted by the clicking sound of a media player engaging, and then, chaos. Projected onto a massive screen behind the altar, the video began: Drew and Nina, unmistakably intimate, caught in a passionate embrace that left little to the imagination. But more damning than the physical betrayal were the words that followed. Recorded snippets of conversation exposed Drew's cruel strategy. His plan to exploit Willow's fractured emotional state, to gaslight her into compliance, to strip Michael of custody, and to ascend, step by step, to an untouchable status within Port Charles's elite circles. His voice was calm, calculating, describing Willow as pliable, easy to steer, and willing to believe anything if wrapped in a promise of motherhood. His tone, his arrogance, his indifference to the damage he caused. Every second of that recording tore down the myth of Drew, brick by brick. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Whispers turned to horrified murmurs. Heads turned. Willow froze mid-step, her bouquet slipping from her trembling fingers. Her knees buckled beneath her as her world caved in around her. Liesl rushed forward to catch her, steadying the broken bride before she collapsed entirely. Willow's breath came in shallow, jagged pulls as she stared at the screen, at the man waiting for her at the altar, who now looked less like a groom and more like a monster. But Nina wasn't finished. Stepping forward again, she pulled from her bag a manila envelope, thick with damning documents. She revealed the falsified psychiatric report, a report Drew had coerced Portia into altering so that Michael would appear mentally unfit, giving Drew an edge in the custody battle. She read aloud the original version, then the doctored copy, and finally presented a sworn statement Portia had signed under duress. Portia, eyes wet with shame and fatigue, stepped forward and confirmed Nina's account before the stunned audience. She could no longer stay silent, she said. Not after what she had seen Drew become. Not after what he had done to Willow, to Michael, and to their children. The guests recoiled. Former allies distanced themselves. Drew's business partners left their seats. Even Scout, his daughter, stood frozen near the front pew, silent and confused, her wide eyes filled with tears. Liesl knelt beside the girl, whispering reassurances, holding her close as the church became a courtroom, the ceremony a trial. The evidence mounted like a wave. There was no refuge left for Drew, no more excuses, no more masks. He stood in full exposure, caught in the harshest light of all, truth. Willow, trembling, turned away from the altar and walked down the aisle alone, her veil trailing behind like a shroud. There were no words. No final confrontation. Just the quiet dignity of a woman reclaiming herself, walking away from the man who had ruined everything she held sacred. Drew was arrested later that afternoon on multiple charges, fraud, coercion, and tampering with medical records among them. His assets were frozen. His board positions revoked. Investigative journalists unearthed additional scandals, from unethical pharmaceutical trials to money laundering through shell nonprofits. His name, once whispered with reverence, became synonymous with disgrace. Nina's act of defiance, once considered irrational, was now seen as an act of courage that saved Willow from the clutches of a sociopath. Yet for Nina, the victory was hollow. Her daughter had not spoken to her since that day. Liesl tried to reassure her that healing takes time, that Willow would come around. But Nina knew better. She had shattered the illusion, yes, but in doing so, she had also shattered Willow's sense of safety, of identity, of trust. And though she knew she did what she had to do, the price was steep. She had rescued her daughter, only to lose her once more. And so, as the sun set over Port Charles, and the wedding flowers wilted under the weight of scandal and sorrow, Nina stood alone at the foot of the church steps, watching the horizon bleed into twilight. She was no longer the woman begging for acceptance. No longer the fragile mother on the outside. She had become something else entirely, something colder, sharper, forged in fire. And Drew, disgraced and dismantled, faded into the shadows of a city he once sought to dominate. But his story wasn't over. Rumors swirled. Files disappeared. Witnesses vanished. And Nina, now bearing secrets darker than even she dared admit, knew that the war wasn't finished. Only the battlefield had changed. In the corner of the once celebratory church, veiled in the long shadows cast by flickering candles and echoing silence, sat little Scout, her back pressed against the cold wooden paneling, her face hidden behind trembling hands. Her sobs, though muffled, cut through the tense quiet that had descended upon the sanctuary like a final judgment. She had always been devoted to her father, clinging to him through moments of confusion and uncertainty, viewing him as her anchor when the world turned upside down. But now, that foundation had cracked beneath her feet, revealing a man she no longer recognized. The father she trusted had vanished beneath a mask of betrayal and manipulation. Every image projected onto the screen, every gasp and accusatory stare, had stabbed deeper into the heart of a child too young to fully grasp the depths of the deceit but old enough to understand its consequences. Liesel Albrecht, her stern demeanor softened by genuine compassion in that moment, crossed the aisle and knelt beside Scout. Without saying a word, she gently gathered the trembling girl into her arms, wrapping her in the folds of her shawl as though to shield her from the chaos unraveling around them. Scout curled into Liesel's embrace, clutching at her blouse with desperate fingers, seeking solace from a world that had so suddenly collapsed. Liesel held her firmly, as though by the sheer force of will she could mend the fractures left behind by Drew's manipulations, as if she could absorb the trauma into herself and leave the child untouched. Her eyes, usually sharp and unrelenting, were glassy now, burning with the fury of a woman who had seen too many children shattered by the sins of the adults who should have protected them. Nina stood a few feet away, frozen. She watched the heartbreaking tableau before her. Scout sobbing in Liesel's arms, Willow standing in stunned silence amid a sea of shattered expectations, and Drew collapsing under the weight of his crumbling lies, and a storm of emotions swirled within her. Guilt. Relief. Anguish. She hadn't planned for this level of devastation, not for Scout, not for Willow. Every step she had taken had been guided by the belief that exposing Drew was necessary to save her daughter, to save others from falling prey to his manipulative charm. But now, looking at the broken girl in Liesel's arms and the vacant expression in Willow's eyes, Nina realized the truth came with a cost far greater than she could have anticipated. She turned toward Willow, silently pleading for understanding. Her eyes searched her daughter's face, hoping, desperately, naively, that Willow might see this act for what it was, not a vendetta born of bitterness, but an act of love. She had pulled back the veil not to destroy, but to free. But Willow didn't return her gaze. She didn't offer a nod of gratitude or a flicker of recognition. She simply stood, trembling, her hands limp at her sides, and looked out across the ruined altar where her future had once stood waiting. And then, in the heavy silence that followed, Willow walked. She moved with the stillness of someone hollowed out, leaving behind her bouquet crumpled on the marble floor, the veil caught on the edge of a pew, fluttering like a discarded dream. Her footsteps echoed through the chapel, the sound chasing away the last remnants of hope from the air. She didn't speak. She didn't turn back. She didn't cry. She just left, abandoning not only the ceremony, but every illusion she had clung to about love, redemption, and the man who promised her both. Outside the church, chaos erupted. Within hours of the video's exposure, law enforcement descended on Drew. He was taken into custody just blocks away from the church after witnesses reported him attempting to flee in a tinted sedan. The arrest was swift and silent, without resistance. Drew had nothing left to fight with. The evidence, compiled meticulously by Nina and supported by Portia's confession, was irrefutable. He was charged with obstruction of justice, coercion, and falsification of medical documents. As the charges piled on, so too did the inquiries. Non-governmental organizations and independent watchdogs began to investigate his corporate partnerships and charitable fronts. It wasn't long before they uncovered the tangled web of deception Drew had woven across state lines. Financial records were subpoenaed, revealing a trail of shadow accounts and off-the-books payments tied to obscure shell organizations. His investments in seemingly benevolent medical research were exposed for what they truly were. Unauthorized clinical trials involving vulnerable patients, many of them children, including several cases tied to experimental drug testing without proper consent. These weren't merely ethical oversights, they were criminal. One man, Kai Taylor, a former financial analyst for one of Drew's dummy corporations, stepped forward with damning evidence. His whistleblower dossier, kept in hiding for months out of fear, was finally published by an investigative journalist. It confirmed Drew's involvement in a clandestine network that funneled funding into unauthorized procedures masked as outreach programs. Internal memos, emails, and surveillance documents linked Drew to the deaths of at least 2 patients, both children, whose conditions had worsened after being administered unapproved medication. Within days, Drew's empire collapsed. Shareholders withdrew. Boards voted unanimously to remove his name from every partnership. His charitable foundations were stripped of their licenses. His name, once spoken in the same breath as Port Charles's most powerful men, became a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Lawsuits mounted. News outlets dissected every aspect of his fall from grace, exposing his manipulations in painstaking detail. He became a ghost walking among the wreckage of his ambitions. And yet, amid the ruin, one image lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it all. Scout, trembling in Liesel's arms, her sobs echoing like a requiem for innocence lost. Willow disappeared in the following days. She didn't return to her apartment. She didn't call anyone. Her phone went silent. Even Liesel, who had long carried a maternal fondness for the young woman, could not find her. Nina searched, frantically at first, then solemnly, as if chasing the memory of someone who had never truly been hers to begin with. She checked hospitals, shelters, the old botanical gardens Willow used to visit with Wiley. Each place gave her only absence, as if the earth itself had swallowed the woman whole. But Nina understood. Because when a heart has been betrayed so deeply, when love has been used as a weapon and trust reduced to ash, sometimes the only way to survive is to vanish. To shed every connection, every name, every history. To walk until the pain is no longer loud enough to hear. And Nina, standing before the altar weeks later as part of the cleanup effort, looked down at the lone petal from Willow's bouquet, faded, crushed into the stone, and she knew. That day had changed everything. Not just for Willow. Not just for Scout. But for all of Port Charles. Because the lie wasn't just Drew's. It was a lie the town had let live for too long. And now that it was gone, no one quite knew what truth looked like anymore. In the days that followed the obliterated wedding, Port Charles became unnervingly quiet, as though the town itself was holding its breath, paralyzed by the aftershock of what had been exposed. The elegant chapel now stood like a ghost of itself, draped in wilting flowers and forgotten decorations, a mausoleum for a future that never came to life. The silence wasn't just physical, it seeped into conversations, lingered in glances, haunted phone calls that went unanswered. And in that silence, Willow vanished. No one knew where she had gone. Not Michael, not Carly, not even the reporters who once hounded her for statements. There were no sightings, no credit card trails, no digital footprints. It was as though she had been swallowed by the very storm that had unraveled her life. Only 2 people in town, Liesel and Nina, kept their silence. Not because they knew where she was, but because they understood why she needed to disappear. They understood that some wounds needed space to bleed before they could begin to heal. Nina had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that once the truth was revealed, she would feel liberated. That the weight of holding it in, of biting her tongue while watching Drew's lies wrap around her daughter like invisible chains, would finally be lifted. And in a way, it was. The chains were broken. The illusion shattered. But what remained in Nina's chest was not relief. It was a cavernous emptiness. Cold, vast, and echoing with a single truth she hadn't prepared for: in saving her daughter, she had lost her. Not to death, not to Drew, but to silence. The kind of silence born of betrayal that cuts deeper than anger, sharper than words. Willow's absence was more punishing than any confrontation could have been. It was absence as exile. Liesel, ever the realist, didn't offer false comfort. She had seen what truth could do, how it cleansed, yes, but also how it scorched. She warned Nina in hushed tones over tea that even justice could carry a price too high. That in the pursuit of righteousness, one might burn the bridge that leads back to the ones they loved. And once gone, that bridge cannot be rebuilt with apologies. Only time might repair it, if time is ever merciful. But Nina, though her eyes welled with unshed tears, remained steadfast. She didn't regret it. She couldn't. She had pulled back the curtain, exposed the darkness Drew had hidden behind charm and calculated vulnerability. She had dragged the monster into the light, not for vengeance, but to save Willow from living a lie that would have devoured her from the inside. If the cost was Willow's voice, her trust, even her love, so be it. Better silence than continued manipulation. Better absence than false security. Better pain than oblivion. Nina returned each day to her penthouse in eerie stillness, the air no longer filled with the sound of Willow's voice or the echo of Scout's laughter. The framed photos remained on the shelves, but they no longer brought comfort, only reminders of what had once been close enough to touch. She would run her fingers along the edge of a coffee cup Willow once used or fold the throw blanket she used to nap under, wondering when, or if, she would ever return. She said nothing to the press, gave no interviews, issued no statements. What she had done wasn't for the world to see. It was for the quiet. For the little girl crying in a chapel. For the woman waking up from a dream that had turned to nightmare. And somewhere, in the outskirts of the town he once hoped to dominate, Drew lingered like an unwanted memory. Stripped of title, of credibility, of alliances, he was no longer a man of vision but a hollow figure moving through the ruins of his ambition.